Somewhere in your email, or in a drawer, or on a screen you barely look at, there's a pay stub, and on it there's a line most people have never actually read, FICA or OASDI. A few letters, a number in a column, money that left before you ever saw it. Here's what that line actually is. It isn't a tax, not exactly. It's a premium on a policy you never applied for, never signed, and can't cancel. And if you died tonight, unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary week, that policy would start paying your children next month and keep paying until they finished high school. You own that right now. Most people who own it have no idea it exists. And for most of American history it didn't. Not a smaller version of it. Not a slower, stingier version. Nothing. From independence in 1776 to the summer of 1939, 163 years, if the person earning the money in an American household died, there was no national system that did anything at all. No check, no claim to file, no office to walk into. And the thing we assume filled that gap, the church, the neighbors, the extended family, the small-town kindness we imagine our great-grandparents lived inside of, that's the hardest part of this story to hear, because those things existed, and we can measure quite precisely how they performed when they were tested. So what happened to a woman in 1880 whose husband was killed in a mill at 34, with 4 children under 10? Where did those children go? And why did so many end up in orphanages while a parent was still alive, still in the same city, still visiting? And why did a country that once spent close to a third of its federal budget on pensions for widows and orphans then leave nearly every other widow with nothing? This story runs through poor farms and paupers' graves, orphan trains carrying children west by the trainload, insurance men climbing tenement stairs collecting nickels, a mine in West Virginia, a locked door on a 9th floor in Manhattan, and 3 legal doctrines so effective at protecting employers that lawyers gave them a nickname. And it ends with a single letter of the alphabet being added to the name of a government program. This is a story about a benefit. Underneath it, it's about a question this country refused to answer for a century and a half. When a family collapses, is that their private misfortune or a risk we all run, and therefore a risk we all pay for? To understand why the collapse was so total, you have to understand how these households were built. Through most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, the American family was economically a single point of failure. One earner, usually the husband. Married women's paid work was constrained by law, by custom, and by wage scales that assumed a woman's income was pocket money. A wife's labor was enormous, continuous, and unpaid, so a household's entire income ran through one body. And that body was far more fragile than we imagine. Death did not arrive at 78, it arrived at 31, 38, 44, typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, infection from a wound that today would be an inconvenience. Childbirth killed women at rates we'd now treat as a national emergency. And then work itself, mines, mills, railroads, foundries, moving machinery with no guards on it. Widowhood wasn't a rare tragedy, it was a common life stage. Walk through any American cemetery from that period and you're reading a demographic table. So if it was that common, why wasn't there a system? Because of an idea. A deep, sincere, load-bearing American idea that poverty was a moral condition. That a man who ended up destitute had somewhere along the way chosen it through drink or idleness, and that money without pain attached would only confirm him in his failure. Reformers spent enormous energy sorting the poor into the deserving and the undeserving. A widow with small children was about as deserving as it was possible to be. The sympathetic case. The one everybody agreed about. And here's the thing to hold on to. Even she did not get a check. What she got was an institution, a caseworker, and a set of conditions. Nobody was coming. So what did people actually do? They improvised. And the first line of defense was other people. Kin took kin in. A widowed daughter moved back into her parents' house. A brother-in-law took the oldest boy and put him to work. Churches ran relief funds and coal funds. A widow took in laundry, took in boarders, cleaned other people's houses, and put her children into the labor market as early as anyone would hire them, which in the mill towns and coal patches meant 9 or 10. In the anthracite fields, boys that age sat over moving coal chutes, picking slate with bare hands. And this worked. Sometimes it genuinely worked. But look at the structure of it. Every family's insurance policy was other families, which is fine, right up until the shock hits everyone at once. A depression, an epidemic, a mine explosion that kills 300 men in one valley on one morning. Then the entire network goes down simultaneously because every household in it is underwater on the same day. And when the network failed, you reached the public system, which existed, and which was designed deliberately to be terrible. The county poorhouse, the poor farm, the almshouse, different names, same institution. Officials of the era had a vocabulary for it. Indoor relief meant the institution. Outdoor relief meant giving people cash or fuel or food in their own homes. And for decades, a powerful reform movement fought to abolish outdoor relief entirely, arguing it corrupted character and rewarded the idle. Several major cities did abolish it outright in the 1870s and 1880s. Sit with that. It's the whole argument of the century in one sentence. The thing they objected to most was the cash. So what was left was the institution, and its guiding principle was that conditions inside had to be worse than the worst available job outside, or people would choose it. That wasn't underfunding. That was the design specification. And these places didn't sort people. The poorhouse held the elderly, the chronically ill, the mentally ill, orphaned children, the disabled, and the widowed, one building, often the same rooms. Losing your husband could put you and your children alongside the county's most desperate cases, because the county had exactly one building. Which brings us to the orphanage, and to the single fact about 19th century American childhood that surprises people most. A very large share of children in American orphanages were not orphans. They had a living parent, sometimes two. They were surrendered, often explicitly as a temporary arrangement, just until things improve. Because a widowed mother could not both earn a wage and supervise small children, and no third option existed. Institutions kept records of parents visiting on Sundays, and of parents reclaiming children years later when they'd remarried or found steady work. Some never managed it. And then there were the trains. Starting in 1854, Charles Loring Brace and the New York Children's Aid Society began putting children from the crowded East on westbound trains to be placed with farm families. Over roughly 75 years, until the practice ended around 1929, an estimated 200,000 children were moved this way. They'd be lined up in a hall or on a platform in a Midwestern town, and local families would come look at them and choose. Some found real families and good lives and said so. Some found unpaid farm labor and a bed in the barn. And siblings were routinely split between towns, a brother taken in Missouri, a sister 2 stops later in Nebraska, neither ever finding the other again. And it's worth being fair. Many people running these places were sincere and doing their best with no money, and Brace genuinely believed a farm beat a tenement. The cruelty wasn't in the people. It was that this was the only machinery that existed. Nobody was coming. Ordinary Americans weren't passive about this. They understood the risk and tried to build the system themselves, from the bottom up. The fraternal orders, the Odd Fellows, the Woodmen of the World, hundreds of local lodges, and an enormous network of black mutual aid and burial societies, built precisely because commercial insurers and public relief either excluded black families or charged them punitive rates. You paid dues. The lodge paid for the funeral and often a modest benefit to the widow. Men in aprons carried your coffin. If you ever walk through an older American cemetery and see a headstone carved to look like a tree stump, a cut trunk with the bark still on it, that's a Woodman of the World death benefit. The marker came with the policy, a 19th century safety net you can put your hand on. Alongside the lodges came the commercial version, industrial life insurance. Small policies sold door to door, premiums collected weekly in cash, a nickel, a dime, by an agent who walked the same streets every Saturday and knew everybody's business. By the early 20th century, tens of millions of policies. So, problem solved? No. And the reason is the hinge of this entire story. Almost all of it was burial insurance. It bought a coffin, a plot, a headstone, and the dignity of not being buried at county expense in an unmarked grave. A pauper's burial was a genuine terror, but it bought a grave, not a future. It covered the cost of the death, not the loss of the income. The insurance man closed the file, the neighbors went home, and Monday morning arrived anyway, and rent was due on the 1st, and no wage was ever coming in again. And the policies had a flaw that's almost cruel in its logic. They lapsed. Miss a few weeks, and the policy simply died. Now ask yourself when a family is most likely to miss weekly payments. The exact stretch when the earner gets sick, stops working, and income falls to nothing. The policy was likeliest to fail in the run-up to the event it existed to cover. Nobody was coming, unless you'd paid every week and hadn't gotten sick first, and the lodge hadn't folded, and even then, what arrived was a headstone. Now here's where it gets strange, because America had already built a national survivors benefit system, running, at scale, and it declined to extend it to anybody else. Civil War pensions. After the war, the federal government paid pensions to Union veterans, and to the widows, orphans, and dependent parents of men who died. Congress expanded eligibility again and again, until by the 1890s roughly 1 million people were on the rolls and the system was consuming in some years on the order of 40% of the entire federal budget. Absorb that. In the 1890s, the United States was running what was functionally a national survivors benefit program, monthly federal checks to widows and to children who had lost a father, with a federal bureau, claim forms, examiners, and appeals. And nobody called it welfare because it wasn't framed as charity. It was framed as earned, a debt owed for services rendered. Remember that, because in 1939 somebody uses it again, very deliberately, but it came with a catch that tells you everything about the era. The pension was conditional on the widow's conduct. Remarry and it ended. Live with a man without marrying him, and this was investigated and it could be revoked. Examiners interviewed neighbors and took depositions about who visited the house and when. So the federal government was paying a woman on condition that she remain unmarried and celibate, and employing men to go find out whether she had. And the fatal limitation, it was tied to one war and one class of men. Never a principle about families, a bill for a specific service. As the veterans and their widows died off, it aged out with them. The machinery existed. The country had proved it could find widows and orphans and send them money every month. It simply decided it owed that only to soldiers. The second near miss came from the states, and it came from a genuinely good impulse. Starting around 1911, Illinois usually gets credit for the first significant law. States began passing mothers' pensions. The logic was direct. It costs more to institutionalize a child than to pay his mother enough to keep him at home, and the child does better at home. Within 2 decades, nearly every state had one on the books. This was a real advance. It put into statute the idea that a mother's care had economic value, and reformers were right to fight for it. But look at how it worked. Funding was local and usually optional. A state could pass an enabling law, and a county could simply decline to appropriate money. Plenty did. The law existed, the fund did not. Where money existed, amounts were set below subsistence deliberately. The pension was meant to supplement a mother's earnings, not replace them. So she still had to work, it still wasn't enough, and she did both jobs badly because there weren't enough hours in the day. And eligibility ran through a suitable home requirement. A caseworker came to the house. She judged the housekeeping, whether the children were clean, whether the mother attended church, whether a man was visiting, whether her manner was appropriately grateful. Aid could be withdrawn on that judgment, often with no appeal. Because administration was local and discretionary, the results were predictable. Black widows and immigrant widows received these pensions at drastically lower rates than white native-born widows, in some cities almost not at all. That isn't a footnote. It's the direct ancestor of what we reach in 1935. So a mother's pension wasn't a right, it was a favor, and a favor can be taken back by whoever granted it. Now the numbers stop being abstract. In the first decades of the 20th century, American industrial work killed people at a rate that's hard to state without sounding like exaggeration. Tens of thousands of deaths a year across mines, railroads, construction, and manufacturing. Widowhood in these towns wasn't bad luck. It was an industrial byproduct with a predictable annual rate. December 6, 1907, Monongah, West Virginia. An explosion tears through 2 connected coal mines. The official toll was 362 men and boys, and almost everyone who has studied it believes the real number was higher. Men brought sons and brothers in to help, unlogged. It's still the worst mining disaster in American history. In one morning, roughly 250 women in a single small town became widows, and about 1,000 children lost their fathers. So here's the question this whole video has been walking toward. What did those families receive? To answer it, you have to understand the legal wall standing between an American widow and any compensation at all. Lawyers of the era had a name for it, the unholy trinity. To recover anything from her husband's employer, a widow had to sue and defeat 3 separate common law defenses. 1. Contributory negligence. If her husband was careless in any degree, even 1% responsible for his own death, the claim failed entirely. Not reduced, failed. 2. Assumption of risk. He knew mining was dangerous when he took the job. He accepted the danger as a condition of employment. So the danger was his, not the company's. 3. The fellow servant rule. If a co-worker caused the accident, another miner's mistake, a foreman's error, the employer wasn't liable at all, and in an explosion set off by a spark, a co-worker did it is almost always available. 3 doors, all locked, and the company only had to keep one of them shut. Then March 25, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, top 3 floors of a building off Washington Square in Manhattan. 146 people died, most of them young immigrant women, many of them teenagers, a great many of them earners for their households. One stairwell door was locked. The fire escape collapsed. The fire department's ladders reached the 6th floor. People on the street watched them come out of the windows. Frances Perkins was at a tea party nearby. She ran toward the smoke and stood in that crowd and watched. 22 years later, she was Secretary of Labor, the first woman in an American cabinet, and in the room when this country finally wrote a social insurance law. She said the New Deal began that day, on that sidewalk. The Triangle families did sue. 23 suits were settled in 1914. The settlement worked out to $75 per life. Nobody was coming, but now finally everybody could see it. The response came fast by the standards of American legislation and was still only half a response. Beginning around 1911, states adopted workers' compensation. Wisconsin's is usually cited as the first comprehensive law, and within a decade most states had followed. The bargain: workers gave up the right to sue and got guaranteed no-fault limited payments for injury and death. The unholy trinity was legislated out of the way, and for the widow of a man killed on the job, that was a transformation. She got something automatically without proving anything. But notice the shape of the hole left behind. Workers' comp covered death at work. It did nothing for a man who caught tuberculosis in a tenement, died of a heart attack at 41, or was hit by a streetcar on a Sunday. And most breadwinners who died did not die on a factory floor. They died of ordinary illness, in ordinary beds, at ages we'd now consider outrageous. Benefits were capped and often time-limited, coverage varied state to state, and agricultural work and domestic service were widely excluded. So by the 1920s, America had built a real system for industrial death and left ordinary death exactly where it had been in 1790. Then everything failed at once. That's the most useful way to understand what the Depression did. It didn't reveal a gap in the safety net. It revealed what the safety net was made of. The kin network failed because the brother-in-law who'd have taken you in was laid off the same month you were. The lodges failed because a mutual aid society is only a pile of other people's dues, and the dues stopped. Industrial insurance failed on a mass scale because a family with no income cannot pay a weekly premium. Policies lapsed by the millions, so at the moment the funeral money mattered most, it was gone. Local relief and mothers' pensions failed because counties ran out of money while facing 10 times the applicants. Private charity failed because demand multiplied and donations collapsed in the same year. Every improvised solution in this video, every workaround, every clever local fix, every act of neighborly decency was funded by other people's ability to pay, and everybody stopped being able to pay on the same day. Out of that came enormous political pressure. Townsend clubs with millions of members, Huey Long and Share Our Wealth, the plain electoral arithmetic of mass destitution. And notice what that pressure was about: the elderly. Overwhelmingly. That's what the country was screaming about, and that's what the administration built for. Which brings us to the fact that surprises almost everyone. The Social Security Act of 1935 did not include survivors' benefits. It didn't. The old age title of that act insured the worker himself, payable when he retired. If he died before then, his family got no pension. They got a lump sum death payment, essentially a refund of what he'd paid in, a money-back guarantee. The philosophy was individual equity. You contribute, you get back what you contributed. The unit protected was the worker, not the household, not the widow, not the children, and then the exclusions. Agricultural laborers and domestic servants were left out entirely. Roughly half of all American workers were outside the system at the start. Because Black Americans were concentrated in exactly those two occupations, the large majority of black workers were shut out, along with enormous numbers of women. So in 1935, the most famous social program in American history was signed into law, and a widow in a coal town with 3 children was still, functionally, living in 1880. Nobody was coming, even then. It took 4 years. An advisory council convened in 1937 and 1938 to review the design, and reached the conclusion this entire history had been arguing for a century and a half. The unit exposed to catastrophic risk is not the worker, it's the household. Protecting a man's retirement while leaving his widow to the county poorhouse isn't insurance. It's an accounting exercise. In August 1939, Roosevelt signed the Social Security Amendments. They moved monthly payments forward to 1940 and added the thing missing since 1776. Benefits for a widow, for children under 18, for a widowed mother caring for those children, paid to her in her own right because raising them was the reason she couldn't earn, for dependent parents, and the program was renamed. Old age insurance became old age and survivors insurance. That's where the S comes from. That's the letter in OASDI on your pay stub. The D, disability, arrives later in the 50s. But the S was added in 1939 because of everything you have just heard. The shift in one line, from what you paid in to what your family lost. From refund to income replacement. Now the honest caveats, because this wasn't a clean victory. It was built on gendered assumptions. Widows were covered readily. Widowers largely weren't, because the law assumed a husband couldn't be dependent on his wife. That stood until the Supreme Court struck it down in the 1970s, in a case brought by a young widower whose wife had died in childbirth, told that benefits available to a mother weren't available to a father. His lawyer was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the occupational exclusions stayed in place for years, expanding only gradually in the 1950s. So the widows of the poorest workers waited longest of all. But here's what 1939 got right, and it's the morale of this entire story. It was structured as insurance, not relief. That single decision meant no morality test. No caseworker in your kitchen judging the housekeeping. No investigator asking neighbors whether a man had been seen at the house. No county board deciding whether you were a suitable mother. No requirement that you stay unmarried to keep the money. You had a claim because your husband had worked and contributed. Earned, not given. For the first time in the history of the country, if the earner died, somebody was coming. Step back, and what you're watching is a country arguing with itself about what kind of thing a family's collapse is. The poorhouse treated it as a character flaw. The burial society treated it as a funeral. The Civil War pension treated it as a debt owed to soldiers. The mother's pension treated it as a favor. Conditional and revocable. Workers' comp treated it as an industrial accident. And 1939 was the first time this country treated it as what it always was. A risk every household runs that no household can insure against alone, and that is therefore cheaper and fairer to insure collectively. Which brings us back to your pay stub. Today, millions of Americans receive survivors' benefits, and a very large share of them are children. Social Security's Survivors Program is, by most measures, the largest life insurance operation in the country, bigger than any private insurer. The SSA puts the coverage a typical young worker with a family has already accrued at several $100,000 in equivalent life insurance. Almost nobody knows they have it, which is, in a strange way, the highest compliment you can pay a piece of infrastructure. You only notice it when it isn't there. So look at the line again. Old age survivors and disability insurance. That middle word is not bureaucratic filler, it's a scar. It's there because of county poor farms and paupers' graves. Because of 200,000 children on westbound trains, because of 362 men in a West Virginia mine, and 250 widows in one town on one morning, because of a locked door on a 9th floor and $75 a life, because of 3 legal doctrines that made a dead worker worth nothing at all. And the argument isn't finished. People are fighting right now over the trust fund shortfall, over whether benefits are adequate for the youngest widows, over whether a program designed in 1939 around a single-earner married household still fits a country where most households have 2 earners or no marriage at all. But notice, those are arguments about how much and for whom, not about whether. The question that took 163 years to answer stays answered. If you didn't know that line on your paycheck had a history, or if you'll look at it differently tomorrow, consider subscribing. We go deep on the systems nobody thinks about until the day they need them.